The amber liquid burned Sarah's throat as she downed the whiskey in one swift motion, her emerald eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight of the silver-dollar saloon. The laughter and crude jokes from the men at the poker table seemed to echo louder tonight, each word cutting deeper into her already wounded soul. She had learned long ago to build walls around her heart, but some nights those walls felt thinner than paper. Tonight was one of those nights. "Sarah, honey, table 6 needs another round," Martha Collins called from behind the bar, her weathered face showing the kind of sympathy that came from understanding what it meant to survive in a world that had little mercy for women like them. Martha had taken Sarah in 3 years ago when she had nowhere else to go, and for that kindness, Sarah would be forever grateful, even if it meant enduring the daily humiliation that came with serving drinks to men who saw her as nothing more than entertainment. As she approached table 6, Sarah caught fragments of their conversation. "I heard she came from back east, probably ran away from something. No decent woman would end up here." The words stung, but not because they were entirely untrue. Sarah had indeed run from something, someone, but the truth was far more complicated than these men could ever understand. She had fled not from shame, but from a life that threatened to suffocate her spirit entirely. The youngest of the miners, barely 20 with dirt still caked under his fingernails, grabbed her wrist as she set down his beer. "How about you sit with us for a while, darling? We could use some company." His grip was firm, his intentions clear, and Sarah felt the familiar knot of fear and disgust tighten in her stomach. She had perfected the art of deflection over the years, learning to navigate these situations with a mixture of charm and firmness that kept her safe while still keeping the customers happy. "I'm afraid I have other tables to serve, gentlemen," she replied with a practiced smile, gently but firmly extracting her wrist from his grasp. "But Martha makes the best whiskey this side of Denver if you're looking for something to keep you warm tonight." The men laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that held an edge of mockery, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she hurried away from their table. The saloon doors swung open with a violent crash, and Reverend Samuel Hayes strode in with the righteous fury of a man who believed himself to be God's appointed judge. His black coat billowed behind him like the wings of a carrion bird, and his pale blue eyes scanned the room with undisguised contempt. The laughter died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to press against Sarah's chest like a physical weight. "This establishment," the Reverend announced in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "is a den of iniquity that poisons the moral fabric of our community. And you," his finger pointed directly at Sarah, trembling with indignation, "are the worst kind of temptation, leading good men astray with your painted face and shameful behavior." Sarah felt every eye in the room turn to her, and the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. She had endured whispers and sideways glances, crude propositions and dismissive treatment, but this public condemnation felt like a physical blow. Her hands trembled as she clutched the empty tray against her chest, using it as a shield against the Reverend's accusations and the judgmental stares of the other patrons. "Reverend Hayes," Martha stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "This is a legal establishment, and Sarah is a good girl who works hard for her keep. I'll ask you to show some Christian charity and remember that we're all sinners in need of grace." But the Reverend's face only grew more pinched with disgust, and Sarah knew that Martha's words, though well-intentioned, would only make things worse. "Christian charity?" Reverend Hayes spat, his voice rising with each word. "There is no charity for those who choose to wallow in sin and drag others down with them. This woman," he pointed at Sarah again, "is a blight on our community, a stain that must be cleansed if we are to build a decent society here." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one chipping away at what little dignity she had left. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over, but she refused to give these people the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She had survived worse than this, had endured humiliation and hardship that would have broken a weaker spirit, but something about this public condemnation felt different. It felt final, like a door being slammed shut on any hope she might have harbored for a different kind of life. As the Reverend continued his tirade, Sarah noticed how the other patrons avoided her gaze, how even the men who had been making crude jokes minutes earlier now looked uncomfortable, as if association with her might somehow contaminate them. She realized in that moment that she had never truly understood how alone she was until now, standing in a room full of people who saw her as less than human. The Reverend's voice seemed to fade into a distant buzz as Sarah's mind retreated to that place she had learned to go when the world became too much to bear. She thought of her childhood, of Sunday mornings in a small church where her father had preached about love and forgiveness before everything had gone wrong. She wondered what that young girl who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings would think of the woman she had become. When the Reverend finally finished his speech and stormed out of the saloon, the silence that followed felt heavier than his words had been. Sarah stood frozen in the center of the room, feeling exposed and vulnerable, like a deer caught in an open field with nowhere to run. She could hear the whispers starting again, could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders, and she knew that tomorrow would bring more of the same. The evening dragged on with Sarah moving through her duties like a ghost, serving drinks and collecting coins, while her mind remained trapped in that moment of public humiliation. She found herself wondering if the Reverend was right, if she really was beyond redemption, if the path she had chosen had led her too far from the light to ever find her way back. The thought terrified her more than any of the physical dangers she had faced, because it suggested that hope itself was a luxury she could no longer afford. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Creek as Sarah made her way to the general store, her head down and her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The events of the previous evening had left her feeling raw and exposed, like a wound that refused to heal. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the Reverend's words over and over until they had worn grooves in her consciousness that seemed impossible to escape. Mrs. Henderson's general store was usually a place of neutral ground, where transactions were conducted with polite efficiency and personal judgments were kept to a minimum. But as Sarah pushed open the door, the familiar bell announcing her arrival, she immediately sensed that something had changed. The three women browsing the fabric display turned to look at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed disgust. "Well, I never," whispered Mrs. Carlton, the banker's wife, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that Sarah could hear every word. "I heard about what happened last night at that establishment. Reverend Hayes was absolutely right to speak out against such shameful behavior." The other women nodded in agreement, their faces set in the kind of righteous disapproval that Sarah had come to recognize as the armor of people who needed to feel superior to someone else. Sarah approached the counter where Mrs. Henderson stood counting inventory, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency through bolts of cloth and spools of thread. The older woman had always been kind to Sarah, treating her with the same courtesy she showed to all her customers, but today there was a tension in her shoulders that spoke of uncomfortable conversations and social pressure. "I need some soap and a spool of blue thread," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had learned to make herself as small as possible in situations like this, to take up as little space as possible, in a world that seemed determined to deny her even the basic courtesy of existence. Mrs. Henderson nodded and gathered the items, but her movements were hurried, as if she couldn't wait for the transaction to be completed. As Sarah counted out the coins from her small purse, she became aware of a conversation taking place near the door. Two men were discussing the previous evening's events, their voices filled with the kind of casual cruelty that men often displayed when they thought themselves unobserved by the objects of their derision. "That saloon girl got what she deserved," one of them was saying, his voice thick with the satisfaction of witnessing someone else's downfall. "Women like that need to be reminded of their place. Can't have them thinking they're as good as decent folk." The other man laughed, a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl with its casual malice. The bell above the door chimed again, and Sarah glanced up to see a man she didn't recognize entering the store. He was tall and lean, with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of honest work under the sun. His clothes were simple, but well-maintained, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he was not a man who was easily swayed by popular opinion or social pressure. Thomas Whitmore had heard about the incident at the saloon from his neighbor, who had recounted the story with the kind of gleeful malice that seemed to infect small towns when scandal provided a temporary distraction from the mundane struggles of daily life. He had come to town to purchase supplies for his ranch, but something about the story had bothered him, gnawing at his conscience like a splinter that refused to be ignored. As he entered the store, Thomas immediately noticed the tension in the air. The way conversations seemed to pause and resume in whispers, the way a young woman standing at the counter seemed to shrink into herself as if trying to disappear entirely. He recognized her from brief glimpses around town, though he had never spoken to her directly. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself with a mixture of dignity and resignation that stirred something protective in his chest. "Excuse me?" one of the men near the door called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from wealth and social position. "Thomas Whitmore, isn't it? I'm Charles Morrison, own the mining operation up the hill. I was just telling my friend here about the spectacle last night at the saloon. That woman there," he nodded towards Sarah, "was put in her place by Reverend Hayes, and not a moment too soon." Thomas looked at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time, and what he saw surprised him. Beneath the carefully composed exterior, he glimpsed an intelligence and strength that seemed at odds with the way she was being discussed. Her green eyes, when they briefly met his, held a depth of pain that spoke of experiences far beyond her years, but also a resilience that refused to be completely broken. "I wasn't aware that public humiliation was considered entertainment in this town," Thomas replied, his voice calm, but with an edge that made Morrison's confident smile falter slightly. "Seems to me that a man's character is better judged by how he treats those who can't defend themselves than by how loudly he proclaims his own virtue." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt her heart stop for a moment, unable to believe that someone had actually spoken in her defense. She had grown so accustomed to being the object of scorn and judgment that the idea of someone taking her side seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Morrison's face flushed red with indignation. "Now see here, Whitmore, that woman is a saloon girl, a painted lady who makes her living off the weaknesses of decent men. She's not fit to be mentioned in the same breath as respectable women." His voice rose with each word, drawing the attention of everyone in the store. Thomas stepped closer to Morrison, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I've known plenty of men who wore fine clothes and spoke of respectability while cheating widows out of their land and beating their wives behind closed doors. I've also known women who worked in saloons to feed their children and keep roofs over their heads. A person's worth isn't determined by their occupation, but by their character." Sarah watched in amazement as this stranger continued to defend her, her hands trembling as she clutched the soap and thread she had purchased. No one had ever stood up for her like this, had ever challenged the assumptions and prejudices that had defined her existence in this town. She felt something stirring in her chest that she had thought was dead, a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had believed. "The lady deserves to conduct her business in peace," Thomas continued, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the store. "And any man who thinks otherwise might want to examine his own conscience before casting stones at others." He turned toward Sarah, his eyes kind but respectful. "Ma'am, I hope you'll accept my apologies on behalf of those who seem to have forgotten their manners." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation or despair. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of being seen as a human being worthy of basic decency. She managed a small nod, not trusting herself to speak without breaking down completely. Morrison muttered something under his breath about bleeding hearts and knowing one's place, but he didn't dare challenge Thomas directly. There was something about the rancher's quiet confidence that suggested he was not a man to be trifled with, and Morrison was not brave enough to find out what might happen if he pushed too hard. As Thomas completed his own purchases, he noticed that Sarah was still standing near the counter, seemingly frozen by the unexpected turn of events. He approached her carefully, as one might approach a wounded animal, his movements slow and non-threatening. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle but concerned. "That was a difficult situation, and I want to make sure you're not hurt." Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time in years, she saw something in a man's eyes that had nothing to do with desire or judgment. She saw genuine concern, human kindness, and something that looked remarkably like respect. "I'm fine," she managed to whisper, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Thank you for what you said. No one has ever—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Thomas understood. He had seen enough of the world to recognize the look of someone who had been kicked so many times that a simple act of kindness seemed miraculous. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," Thomas said simply. "It's not charity, it's just decent behavior. I'm Thomas Whitmore, by the way." He didn't extend his hand, understanding instinctively that such a gesture might be misinterpreted by others watching, but his introduction was warm and genuine. "Sarah," she replied, her voice growing slightly stronger. "Sarah McKenna." It was the first time in months that she had said her full name with anything approaching pride, and the sound of it spoken aloud to someone who didn't immediately judge her for it felt like a small miracle. As they parted ways outside the store, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't destined to remain forever trapped in the narrow confines of other people's expectations. Thomas Whitmore had called her a lady, had defended her honor, and in doing so had reminded her that she was more than the sum of her circumstances. For the first time in a long time, Sarah McKenna dared to hope. The encounter at the general store had planted a seed of doubt in Sarah's mind that grew stronger with each passing day. She found herself questioning everything about her life in Silver Creek, from the worn wooden floors of the saloon to the hollow laughter that echoed from the poker tables each night. Thomas Whitmore's simple act of kindness had cracked open something inside her that she had sealed away years ago. A part of herself that remembered what it felt like to be treated as more than just a commodity. As she stood before the cracked mirror in her small room above the saloon, Sarah barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The heavy makeup that had become her armor suddenly felt like a mask, hiding not just her natural features, but her true self. Her fingers trembled as she traced the outline of her face, remembering the girl she had been before life had forced her into choices she never wanted to make. "What am I doing here?" she whispered to her reflection, the words carrying the weight of 3 years of unspoken questions. She thought about the letters she had written to her sister back in Boston, but never sent, each one sitting in a drawer, like a bridge she was too afraid to cross. The woman in the mirror looked tired, worn down by the constant performance of being someone she wasn't, and Sarah wondered if it was too late to find her way back to who she used to be. The routine of serving drinks and deflecting unwanted advances had become automatic, but now each interaction felt different. When old Pete grabbed her wrist and slurred propositions in her ear, she found herself pulling away more firmly than before. When the traveling salesman tried to follow her upstairs, she stood her ground and told him no with a conviction that surprised them both. Martha noticed the change immediately, her weathered eyes following Sarah's movements with concern. "You've been different since that day at Henderson's store," Martha observed one evening as they cleaned glasses together. "That rancher really got to you, didn't he?" Sarah's hands stilled on the glass she was polishing, her mind immediately conjuring the image of Thomas Whitmore's kind eyes and respectful demeanor. She had thought about him every day since their encounter, replaying his words and the way he had made her feel human again. "He called me a lady," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible above the piano music drifting from the main room. "When's the last time anyone called me that?" Martha's expression softened with understanding, and she reached out to squeeze Sarah's hand with fingers that had seen their own share of hardship and compromise. "Maybe it's time to remember that you are one," Martha replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned hard lessons about self-worth. "This life, it doesn't have to be permanent, you know. You're still young, still have time to choose something different." The words hung in the air between them like a lifeline, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race with possibility. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the saloon below gradually fade into silence. She thought about the money she had saved, hidden away in a small tin box under her floorboard. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere where no one knew her history or her mistakes. The idea terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She thought about Thomas Whitmore, about the way he had stood up for her without expecting anything in return. She wondered if there were other men like him in the world, men who saw women as human beings rather than objects to be used or judged. The possibility seemed almost too good to be true, but for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life. As dawn broke over Silver Creek, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find Thomas Whitmore and thank him properly for his kindness. More than that, she was going to ask him a question that had been burning in her mind since that day in the store. Did he really believe that someone like her could become something more than what she was? The answer, she realized, would determine the direction of the rest of her life. Sarah found Thomas mending a fence at the edge of his property, his sleeves rolled up and sweat glistening on his forehead in the afternoon sun. She had walked the 3 miles from town with her heart pounding, rehearsing what she would say and losing her nerve with every step. When he looked up and saw her approaching, his expression was one of genuine surprise, but no judgment, which gave her courage to continue forward. "Miss McKenna," he said, setting down his tools and removing his hat respectfully. "This is unexpected. I hope everything is all right." His concern was immediate and authentic, and Sarah felt that familiar flutter of recognition at being treated with such consideration. She noticed how he kept a respectful distance, understanding instinctively that her reputation could be damaged further if they were seen together improperly. "I wanted to thank you," she began, her voice stronger than she had expected, "for what you did at the store. No one has ever stood up for me like that." Thomas studied her face, seeing beyond the carefully applied powder and rouge to the intelligent, wounded woman beneath. There was something different about her today, a determination that hadn't been there before. "You don't need to thank me for treating you like a human being," Thomas replied. "That should be the standard, not the exception." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "May I ask you something, Miss McKenna? What brought you to Silver Creek? You don't talk like someone who grew up in mining towns." Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under his gentle questioning. "I was a schoolteacher," she said quietly, the words feeling strange after years of hiding that part of herself. "In Boston, I taught children to read and write, helped them discover that books could take them anywhere they wanted to go." Her voice carried a wistfulness that spoke of dreams long abandoned. Thomas nodded, unsurprised by this revelation. "I thought as much. You carry yourself like an educated woman, despite..." He gestured vaguely, indicating her current circumstances without judgment. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" The story poured out of her then. 3 years of bottled-up truth spilling forth like water from a broken dam. She told him about her engagement to Robert Caldwell, a respected banker's son who had seemed like everything a proper young woman should want. She spoke of discovering his true nature too late, of the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves and the threats that kept her silent. "I ran," she said simply. "One night when he was particularly violent, I took what little money I could and left. I had nothing, no references, no family who would believe me over him. When I reached Silver Creek, I was starving and desperate. Martha offered me work and She trailed off, shame coloring her cheeks. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah feared she had revealed too much, that even this kind man would judge her for the choices she had made. But when he spoke, his voice was filled with admiration rather than condemnation. "You survived," he said firmly. "You did what you had to do to live, and there's no shame in that. The shame belongs to the man who hurt you and the society that failed to protect you." His words hit her like a physical blow, but one that healed rather than wounded. "I've been thinking," Sarah continued, emboldened by his acceptance, "about what you said at the store, about a person's worth being determined by their character. Do you really believe someone like me could become something different, could start over?" Thomas met her eyes directly, his gaze steady and sure. "Miss McKenna, I believe you already are something different. You just need the chance to show the world what I can already see." Word of Sarah's visits to Thomas Whitmore's ranch spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, carried on the tongues of those who found excitement in scandal and righteousness in judgment. By the time Sarah returned to town after her second visit, a crowd had gathered outside the saloon, their faces twisted with the kind of moral outrage that masked deeper, uglier emotions. Reverend Hayes stood at the center of the mob, his black coat billowing in the wind like the wings of a vengeful angel. His voice carried across the dusty street as he preached about corruption and the need to cleanse their community of undesirable influences. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the dangerous undercurrent in his words, the way crowds could quickly turn from mere disapproval to something far more violent. "That woman has now set her sights on corrupting one of our most respected citizens," the Reverend proclaimed. His finger pointed accusingly at Sarah as she tried to slip quietly through the crowd. "Thomas Whitmore is a God-fearing man, a pillar of our community, and we cannot allow her to drag him down into her world of sin and depravity." Charles Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his face flushed with the satisfaction of vindicated prejudice. "I warned Whitmore about getting involved with her type, but he wouldn't listen. Now look what's happened. She's probably got her claws in him already, promising him things no decent woman would even think about." Sarah felt the familiar walls of shame and fear closing in around her, but this time something was different. Thomas's words echoed in her mind, his belief in her worth and his conviction that she deserved better than this treatment. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, meeting the hostile gazes with a dignity that surprised even herself. "I have done nothing wrong," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd with unexpected strength. "Mr. Whitmore has shown me nothing but kindness and respect, something that seems to be in short supply in this town." The crowd murmured angrily at her defiance, but Sarah pressed on. "I was a school teacher before I came here, and I am still the same person I was then, regardless of what circumstances forced me to do." The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathered townspeople. A school teacher, the woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a painted saloon girl, had once educated children, had once been respectable. Some faces showed confusion, others skepticism, but Sarah saw a few expressions soften with uncertainty. Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd, her face troubled but determined. "Is this true, Sarah? You were really a teacher?" When Sarah nodded, the older woman's expression grew thoughtful. "My grandson mentioned you helped him with his reading when he was having trouble at school. Said you were real patient with him, made him feel smart instead of stupid." But Reverend Hayes would not be deterred by such inconvenient truths. "Do not be fooled by her lies and manipulations," he shouted over the murmurs of doubt beginning to ripple through the crowd. "A fallen woman is still fallen, regardless of what she claims about her past. She seeks to poison our community and corrupt our men with her wiles." The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the tension like a knife, and every head turned to see Thomas Whitmore riding hard toward the crowd, his face set with grim determination. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with an authority that commanded immediate attention. "What exactly is going on here?" Thomas demanded, his voice carrying the kind of quiet power that made even the Reverend pause in his condemnation. His eyes swept over the crowd before settling on Sarah, and she saw something there that gave her strength, unwavering support, and a promise that she would not face this alone. Thomas stepped into the circle of hostile faces with the calm confidence of a man who had faced down stampeding cattle and mountain lions. His presence seemed to fill the space, commanding respect even from those who opposed him. He looked directly at Reverend Hayes, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Reverend, I'm surprised to find a man of God leading what appears to be nothing more than a lynch mob," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I thought your faith taught compassion and forgiveness, not public humiliation and condemnation." The Reverend's face flushed red, but Thomas continued before he could respond. "Miss McKenna has done nothing wrong except try to better herself, which I thought was something we encouraged in this country." Charles Morrison pushed forward, his face twisted with indignation. "She's a saloon girl, Whitmore. She's been filling your head with lies and sob stories, probably trying to get her hooks into your money and property. Can't you see what she's doing?" His words carried the ugly undertone of a man who couldn't comprehend that a woman might be valued for anything beyond what she could provide to men. Thomas turned to face Morrison fully, and something in his expression made the mining boss take an involuntary step backward. "What I see," Thomas said quietly, "is a woman who has survived circumstances that would have broken weaker people. What I see is someone who taught children to read, who shows kindness to those society has forgotten, who carries herself with more dignity than most of the so-called respectable people in this town." He moved to stand beside Sarah, not touching her, but close enough that his support was unmistakable. "Miss McKenna has told me about her past, about why she came here, and about what she hopes for her future. She was a school teacher who fled an abusive engagement, and she's been working to save money to start over somewhere else. If that's not admirable, I don't know what is." A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed this information. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the whispers. "If Sarah was really a teacher, maybe we should be asking why our children are struggling with their lessons when we have someone qualified right here in town." Other voices joined hers, parents remembering their children's difficulties with reading and arithmetic. Reverend Hayes, sensing his moral authority slipping away, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Do not be deceived by smooth words and fabricated stories. This woman is a temptation sent to test our resolve, and we must not waver in our righteousness." But his words fell on increasingly deaf ears as more townspeople began to question their assumptions. Thomas looked directly at Sarah, his eyes warm with something that made her heart race. "Miss McKenna, I have a proposition for you. My ranch needs a teacher for the children in the area, including my own daughter, who's been struggling with her lessons since her mother died. The position comes with a house of your own and a respectable salary. What do you say?" The crowd fell completely silent, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that the man who had first called her a lady was now offering her the chance to become one again in the eyes of the world. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore, I would be honored to accept." As Thomas smiled and offered her his arm, Sarah McKenna walked away from the Silver Dollar Saloon forever, her head held high and her future bright with possibility.